So at this point, everyone obviously knows the hood classics of metal and the most influential, but in this video, what I wanted to do is shine a light on some bands that, yeah, you might know, but you may not know how much influence they had on other genres, other bands for decades. Some more relatively unpopular picks are ones that don't immediately come to mind, and of course, if you end up enjoying this video, drop a like, subscribe if you're new here, and let me know down in the comment section below your picks for some of the most influential and important metal bands or rock bands that don't get talked about nearly as much. My list is going to be starting out with Sunn. Now, Dylan O'Malley and Greg Anderson have been creating drone metal for quite some time now, a very idiosyncratic form of metal that is centered around a long, lull, droning composition that usually is extremely scant, just overall minimalistic, think similar to funeral doom metal, usually going hand in hand with a production style that seeks to exemplify how despondent and hopeless a lot of the compositions end up feeling. They can feel just as bright as they do devoid of any emotion and extremely dark. Sunn has had an incredible influence, and I made an entire video years ago about the importance of Sunn and how they sort of revolutionized how a lot of extreme music projects, metally and otherwise, looked at things like noise, distortion, very long compositions, as well as how you can string out one singular idea into a large sprawling tapestry that ends up being incredibly fun to listen to and very rewarding and sort of like a full body experience, simultaneously challenging listeners to redefine how they looked at music and redefined how they looked at metal, which is notoriously a genre that is known for being extremely busy, unless you're talking about some of the slower genres like doom metal and sludge metal. So Sunn sort of paved the way for a lot of other bands and a lot of listeners to sort of discover how metal doesn't always have to be fast and doesn't always have to be just a low trudge. It can be something that is just a full body experience overall. Next up, the band that I'm gonna shout out is the Melvins. The Melvins are one of those bands that I feel like everyone knows. Everyone knows the look. Everyone knows what the lead vocalist looks like, and generally speaking, they are kind of associated with the same crowd as like the Grateful Dead and Twisted Sister sort of crowds of, you know, hippies and people that smoke weed and don't take things too seriously, but they are associated with a lot of different genres, and I think people forget how prolific they are. The Melvins are one of those names that is such a hallmark for music as a whole, not just metal, but it's in the general lexicon of music knowledge. So while there may be a lot of people that know them just by name alone, or maybe somewhat of what they sound like, they don't understand just how many influences they brought into their style, as well as how much influence they put out across the entire metal and rock landscape, going into so many different genres. The way that they approach things like noise and distortion and feedback and taking noise rock influences, punk influences, sludge influences, grunge influences later in their career, alternative influences, garage rock influences, putting it all together into this weird, freakish experimental music style that has always been hard to define, and there is no band that sounds like the Melvins. The next band I want to shout out is Ringworm, and Ringworm is incredibly important if you are a hardcore punk or specifically a metalcore fan. These guys formed in 1989, and similar to the Melvins, were and are extremely prolific as a band. They've released so much material over the decades. I've always been a big advocate for them because I don't think they've gotten their roses nearly as much as they should. They existed as a metalcore band before metalcore even existed as a term. A lot of metalcore got its roots in like the mid to late 1990s, and it's kind of debatable of some hardcore punk bands from the late 80s going into the early 90s if they would be considered metalcore and what band was the one to start it. But from the get-go, they took hardcore punk in a very metallic direction, taking metal influence, and I've heard them called everything from post-hardcore to hardcore punk to metalcore. They have a lot of different influences, but the fact that they were kicking ass in the early 90s as a metalcore band, and you know it's really cool when a band sort of revisionarily gets called something, like when a term didn't really exist when they came around and then it gets put on them later because people are like, wow, you were a trailblazer. That's Ringworm. And on top of that, they just make great music, so definitely check them out if you're unfamiliar with them. Next up, I want to talk about Winds of Plague. So deathcore is a very interesting subgenre. It's went through a lot of different changes throughout time. It's been a very transformative genre. It's went through a lot of metamorphosis. There's been a lot of offshoots. There's been a lot of debate and controversy of what is considered true blue deathcore. And deathcore is one of those subgenres that has always seek to sort of up the ante, push the envelope, and do things everything's experimental. Everything from the very shrill and brittle low-fidelity deathcore, the very raw stuff, or the very hyper-produced Slaughter to Prevail and Lorna Shore-esque music. You have the very progressive, technical, djenty deathcore bands, and then you have the symphonic deathcore bands. Arguably the most important and influential and popular deathcore offshoot right now, you are seeing a lot of bands adopt the symphonic, blackened deathcore style. Everything from bands like Lorna Shore to bands like Worm Shepherd, and even some of Slaughter to Prevail's works are very theatrical and cinematic, but Winds of Plague, similar to Ringworm, were doing this in the 2000s. They predated a lot of the symphonic deathcore stuff, and they were incorporating those elements of black metal and blackened symphonic metal into a deathcore style before that ever really took off or became popular. And I remember a time when Winds of Plague was kind of considered cringy and weird and an outlier, and look at them now. They pretty much paved the way for a lot of these other bands influentially, so I wanted to put them here. Next band I want to shout out is Testament. I feel like Testament just does not get enough hype for how amazing they are. I am one of those people that kind of feels like Testament should be swapped around with Anthrax and the Big Four. I've seen Testament live. I fucking love Testament. They're one of my favorite thrash metal bands, and I'd kind of put them above quite a few of the Big Four, but they had a lot of influence on thrash metal too. They coexisted around the time of the big bands that you hear, like the Metallicas and the Slayers and the Megadeths and the Anthraxes, but they never really were in the same conversation. But the people that enjoyed thrash metal, specifically bands around that time, loved Testament, and they've been kicking ass for a long time. Their consistency as a band, their high quality, their solos, their shredding, the vocals, it is peak thrash metal, and it had a ton of influence, even if they aren't held in the same regard as the Big Four. Next up, Polyphia. I know Polyphia and Tim Henson are kind of a meme because of TikTok and the TikTok era, but that's part of the reason that I wanted to put them here. Polyphia has gotten so many people into guitar music and trying to learn the guitar. I can't tell you how many people that I've either spoken to or that I've seen online that said that one of the major reasons that they got into instrumentation is because Tim Henson really revolutionized how they saw guitar music and how they saw that form of music, and taking a lot of different influences and putting it into a very sort of sanitized and well-established version of metal and rock has proven to be a very profitable business model for Polyphia. But when it comes to Tim Henson, he's such a down-to-earth dude, and the way that he approaches things and seeks to kind of get people excited about music is why I think that they're so important and so influential, because there's something to be said about excitement in music, not just hearing what you hear from every other artist ever. When you hear a band or you hear a person that redefines how you see a genre or gets you excited to learn something yourself or to listen to more stuff yourself. So Polyphia, whether as a gateway band or as just an influential property, I wanted to put them on this list. Similarly, a band I want to just give a quick shout out to would be Animals as Leaders. So this is a band that, oh my god, Tosin Abasi, just Tosin Abasi full stop. They were another band that prior to the whole TikTok craze, like they've existed for a very long time, were very instrumental in developing a lot of progressive, djenty, metalcore and instrumental style bands. They've been kind of all over the place, but it's the guitar playing. I have heard multiple well-established guitarists, like very well-established either YouTubers or guitarists, say that Animals as Leaders knocked them flat on their ass growing up because they had never heard something like they did in that band. And it's not just that Tosin Abasi eclipses everything, the whole band is really good, and their technicality, how they write riffs, how they just write their compositions as a whole is incredibly impressive and very influential on a ton of guitar players, specifically in the prog sphere. When it comes to black metal, there are a lot of names that you immediately think of. You think of Immortal and Mayhem and Venom and Bathory and Burzum and Death Heaven and Liturgy if you're in the modern sphere. But I am always someone that really likes to hype up Emperor, and not just for their famous record In the Nightside Eclipse, but all 4 of their studio-length albums, because they existed at a time when black metal was pretty homogenous and it had a very cult-like status. It wasn't necessarily still in its infancy, but when it came to the Norwegian scene, you oftentimes saw a lot of bands stick to a similar formula and a similar pattern, and it was phenomenal. So when you looked at bands like Darkthrone and Mayhem and Immortal, they played a very specific style of black metal, and they didn't really deviate from that. So whenever you saw a band that was willing to pierce through that and sort of take influence from other things and put it into music without compromising, without sacrificing what made that genre good to begin with, it is incredibly impressive. And that's exactly what Emperor did when they brought brought in symphonic, cinematic elements into black metal, inspiring countless symphonic black metal bands that came after them, but not only that, but also atmospheric black metal bands, because they also sort of go into that field a little bit. And for being at a time when that wasn't really widespread, and when black metal sort of got shunned or pushed aside, or you were called a poser in a sense if you were doing anything weird, which kind of still exists today, I think it was really cool to see Emperor take that into a new direction in a time when black metal, the only deviation was if you were going to include dark ambient stuff into your music. Next up, Infant Annihilator. I don't think I need to rant much about this because I've talked about Infant Annihilator a lot. I made an entire video called The Importance of Infant Annihilator. I highly recommend it if you want a deep dive. But Infant Annihilator, I stand by the fact that they completely, 100%, hands down, paved the way for the modern sphere of reaction content deathcore with 50,000 breakdowns in a song that are larger than life. When Infant Annihilator came on the scene, they were very polarizing. They had so much controversy associated with them, whether it be their music videos, whether it be the fact they were silly and didn't take themselves too seriously, or the fact that people just thought it was way too over the top and phoned in and they hated deathcore and whatever. Deathcore is metal has always gotten a bad rep though. But Infant Annihilator was doing things that you did not fucking see in deathcore at the time. Even the namesake bands were not doing anything close to them. They had breakdowns that were sounding so crisp and so awe-inspiring and 50,000 mile high skyscraper riffs. It was incredible, as well as the things Dickie Allen was doing with his vocals set the stage and precedent and up the pedestal, push the pedestal way high up to challenge other vocalists to expand their range, to get more grunterial, to get more gruesome, and challenge bands to write riffs and breakdowns that were much larger. And whether or not you agree with the loudness war or the direction that deathcore and modern metal has gone in, you cannot deny that Infant Annihilator was probably the singular band to have the most influence on that sphere. Next up, I want to talk about Last Days of Humanity. My lord, so many gore grind bands want to be this band, and it shows. I have never heard a gore grind band that has outdone Last Days of Humanity, ever. The only one that has gotten even remotely close to me in modern sphere is Pharmacist. I think Pharmacist, I believe it's from a project from Japan, is phenomenal, but when it comes to Last Days of Humanity, so many extreme metal bands and gore grind bands are trying to get that snare sound, trying to get those vocals, trying to get those dirty riffs. So unless you're looking at a band like Pharmacist, or you're looking at a band like Pissgrave, or maybe Fluids, you're going to be hard-pressed to find another gore grind band that did what Last Days of Humanity did. Whether or not you like them or not, Liturgy has to be here. Liturgy has completely shifted the topic of discussion for black metal. You could put Death Heaven here too, because I think that the way that they took black gaze and took it into the new sphere is very important, but there are other bands that came before them that I feel like I would talk about more. Alcest, Wolves in the Throne Room were both doing black gaze before that, but when it comes to Liturgy, oh boy. Throughout my timeline on this channel, and my timeline as a metalhead, I have never in my life seen a single black metal band or even a metal band garner as much ire as Liturgy has garnered. Most of the time, if people don't like something, they just will be, generally speaking, indifferent. But when it comes to Liturgy, people either adore Liturgy or hate Liturgy. And the way that Ravenna has taken her philosophy and put it into the music and put more representation into black metal, as well as how they write black metal and the coverage of them at the time and the polarization at the time, I feel like Liturgy is one of the most important black metal bands, because I feel like black metal as a whole was always intended to be outsider and was always intended to challenge norms. And Liturgy took that to the next level, unintentionally or intentionally. And whether you love them or love to hate them or hate to love them, Liturgy has to be on this list. Next up, I gotta talk about Cryptopsy. So there are a lot of tech death bands that get a lot of hype, and Cryptopsy has certainly got a lot of praise, specifically for the album None So Vile, which is considered one of the crown jewel metal records, not even just of its genre, just metal as a whole, of the 1990s. But Cryptopsy's influence on not only technical death metal, but brutal death metal is what makes them incredible incredibly impressive to me because they've touched on a lot of different forms of death metal throughout their runtime, and specifically even outside of None So Vile, they have an incredibly influential discography. And while Cryptopsy is one of the bands on this list that I feel like everyone understands their influence, I just wanted to shout them out because I feel like they kind of get lumped in with just tech death, but they had influence past that too. I'll probably get some hate for this, but I'm gonna put Asking Alexandria here. Asking Alexandria is a weird band because I don't really like them anymore. I don't really like a lot of their modern music. I was a fan of their early stuff, but it is impossible to describe the influence that Asking Alexandria had on the scene metalcore sphere, not to mention the millions of fans that praise on the altar of their OG style. I understand that they're a band that a lot of people just don't like because they were very cringy, but similar to how Nirvana was kind of misunderstood by a lot of people that weren't in Gen X or weren't in that younger sphere, Asking Alexandria was very influential to a young crowd. And while you can say there were other bands at the time that did great stuff too for the genre, Icy Stars, Inner Shikari, Attack Attack, none were as influential as Asking Alexandria for that weird electronicore mixture of sceney boy metalcore. It was massive at the time, and it started an entire craze that still has a lot of people in that scene to this day. But that wraps up my list. I would love to hear your list down in the comment section below. Definitely let me know, and your thoughts on my list. Agree or disagree, there is no wrong answer. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, and I'm signing off saying farewell.